All right, that says it.
All right, welcome again. I can say I have a lot of stuff here. I'm gonna.
Did you turn the mic
A
on?
lot of different things, but I'm gonna try and make them related as much as possible. I'm also gonna put in some stuff that is just good to know. Oh,
There we
there
go.
we go. Okay, okay. So one of the things I want to stress is how much economics is woven through the Greek and Hebrew scriptures. It's actually quite amazing. And, a lot of people who went to church, for instance, when they were younger, if they went to certain Protestant churches and they recited the Lord's Prayer on Sunday morning, they said, "Forgive us our debts as we herewith as we forgive our debtors." But that's a banking term in Greek. It's not a metaphor. It's talking about actual debt. And you find that word to talk about debt in the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek scriptures all throughout. And you have the prophets, the Nevi'im. The prophets are largely people who are speaking an economic message. People like Isaiah, Yeshayahu in Hebrew. They're talking about money, wealth, and poverty. They're condemning people who grab all the wealth and leave the poor in the gutter. And so this guy, Yeshu, that's how he would have said his name. Not Yeshua, not Jesus, not Jesus, but Yeshu, the Galilean dialect of Aramaic. As a child, his mother would have called him Yesu. That's a diminutive version. But Yeshu was how he was called in the Galilee. And he too was a Navi, a prophet, meaning that he too was talking about economics. Now there's things, when people talk about reading the Bible, very often they talk about the great stories, people remember from their childhood David and Goliath, or they heard about the crucifixion, or they heard about Sodom and Gomorrah, or they heard, some kind of dramatic story. But the actual texts of what's written down are much more varied than people are aware of and address issues that many people are not aware of unless they actually sit down and read the whole damn thing, which most people don't do, and I understand why. It's a long bunch of books. It's not one book, it's a whole collection of books. And some of them are more interesting than others. No question about that. But let me read something to you. This is from the book of Shemot, which we in English call Exodus. You must never repeat a baseless rumor. Never side with a bad person to give malicious evidence. You must not follow a majority to do wrong in the world. Nor must you bear witness in court so as to side with an unjustly treated minority. Neither must you be partial to anyone except as a human being. If you come across your enemy's ox or ass wandering lost, you must be sure to take it back to that person. If you see the animal of a person who absolutely hates you, you have to take the animal back to him. You must never tamper with a poor man's right in the court. Avoid false charges. Never have innocent or guiltless people put to death, nor acquit evil men. You must never accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds even those whose eyes are open, and it destroys the case of a good person. You must never mistreat a foreigner, an alien, for you yourselves were aliens in the land of Egypt, and you know what an immigrant feels. For 6 years you may sow your land and gather it into crops. But every 7th year you must let the land be, to lie fallow, so that poor people may pick up something, anything that you leave. So with your vineyards and with your olive yards. For 6 days you shall labor, but on the 7th day you shall desist from work. Even your animals must rest, that you may all be refreshed. Now, some of those things that I'm reading, which were put down probably, it was oral for a long time. It certainly wasn't written by Moses. But these laws were written down, we think, in pieces from 700 to 500 and put in final form around 500 BC. And we think by a man named Ezra, who organized the Torah from 4 different strands of authors who wrote over a period of about 700 years. So the Hebrew, like if you look at Shakespeare, there are some words you're just not going to get because English has changed. And if you try to read Chaucer in the original, you are in deep trouble. So the same thing is true when people are looking at these ancient Hebrew texts. They can discern, if they know Hebrew fluently, they can discern that various threads were written at different times. And they can figure out that they may have been written in different places. And there's clues given in each of these sections of the 4 sections. Some only use the word Elohim for God. Some only use the word Yahweh for God. Some use other words like El Shaddai. And these are clues that these words were important at different times in history. So, but it was put together, and it was put together in a rather sloppy way. Meaning, if I ask you, and you've been seeing cartoons about this all of your life, how many animals went aboard the ark? You'll say 2 of every kind, and all the cartoons show 2 of every kind, 2 giraffes and so. Well, it also says only 7 pairs of animals went on the ark. Now you can't have both things true at the same time, but the reason they're both there is the editor was trying to be fair and record all of the historical stories understood by different classes of people. The 7 animals were all sacrificial animals, so that was obviously written by a priest who's interested in sacrifice and so forth. So you can go through all of these books and you can see that there's just a lot of different ways of interpreting what they were trying to say in the context of the time period that it may have been written. Now you heard about leaving the crops fallow. Now listen to this. So the first part was from Shemot, Exodus. This second reading is chapter 25 in the book of Vayikra, or Leviticus. The Eternal gave Moses on Mount Sinai these ordinances for the Israelites. When you enter the land I give you, the land shall enjoy a Sabbath. For 6 years you may sow your field, for 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the produce, but the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of the entire rest of the land, a Sabbath in honor of the Eternal, on which you must neither sow a field nor prune a vineyard, and which you must not even gather the aftergrowth of your harvest nor grapes from your undressed vines. It shall be a year of entire rest for the land. The natural produce of the land shall serve as food for you, so wild things. And for you and your slaves, male or female, because slavery was perfectly okay in ancient times. However, you shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so 49. So that the 7 weeks of years amount to 49 years, and then on the 10th day of the 7th month, you must sound a loud trumpet blast throughout the land, a trumpet blast that shall sound aloud on expiation day. You must hallow the 50th year by proclaiming liberty for all the people in the land. It shall be a jubilee year to you. The 50th year, you will not grow your crops, and you will set free all of your slaves, and you will cancel all debts owed to you, and you will restore land that you had confiscated and took from others to make a profit over the last decades. And you shall welcome any guest to your house, no matter where they come from, and treat them well. So that's a very unusual thing, but maybe not so unusual. The Greeks did the same thing. They had a very similar law in some city-states where the economy was restored to balance. They figured that some people are going to make more money than others because they have certain skills, and others don't have those skills. But that seemed unfair ultimately, that some people could take off with everything, and other people would remain in poverty for good. So it was a way to address a very big split in the classes. The people I know from South America, for instance, who wrote in Spanish from a point of view of Marxism and talking about scriptures, point all of this out very clearly, that this was an amazing thing to have been suggested 2,500 years ago and written down. So slaves were set free, debts were canceled, property was restored if you had confiscated it, and the land was returned to its original wild place, and you got by on what you stored and things like that, but you also made sure that the poor had access to it so they could live during these 2 years. This was a law written down in the Torah, and you can be sure that people found every excuse possible not to follow it. And it's brought, the prophets will bring it up every once in a while, and they get pushback. No, we can't do that. Come on. And my reading of the Greek scriptures is that Yeshua was very much inspired by these particular passages. And so he told lots of stories during his time on earth that addressed this class problem between the rich and the poor and debts. So I'm going to do something now give you a sense of how far we are away from that time. I'm going to read something in Aramaic. Aramaic is not Hebrew light, like some people like to think it is. It's a totally different Semitic language than Hebrew. There's a lot of connections, just like there's connections between Italian and Spanish. But Italian is not Spanish and Spanish is not Italian. A speaker of Aramaic might be able to understand some Hebrew, figure it out because there's some similar consonant clusters, but there are different languages. Ava Yitkadash Shemak, Ete Malkutak, Lahman Dechlimbar, Habla Yomate, Ushabak Wan Hobinan, Kadish Baknan, Lahabanan, La Ta Elinan Liznon. That's the Lord's Prayer. Now, most scholars like,
But when you started out in talking about the Lord's Prayer,
yeah,
I grew up in a Catholic family.
right,
Forgive us our debts as we forgive yours, that line.
yeah, that was trespasses.
Well, I learned it in German.
Okay, what did you say in German?
Probably Schuld, forgive uns unsere Schuld.
Should
Yeah, that,
means, which translates as what?
that's that.
Yeah, it's okay, okay,
And either moral or financial. What I was going to ask you, I never even once thought of it as financial, but as sin.
right.
Now, was I just a particularly poor student? Was that ever, I don't remember that ever being pointed out to me as being financial.
Well, you know how I just said that throughout Jewish history, the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, the 50th year, was a problem that they tried to sidestep. The same thing was true in the history of the Christian churches. The idea that debts might be at the center of prayer, and if that was a monetary term, they stressed the metaphorical to avoid the economic.
Because they just really didn't want to follow that.
Right, yeah, basically,
Okay.
that's what it comes down to, yeah. So, now most scholars would say that the construction of the Lord's Prayer was not from Jesus standing on a hill one day and somebody says to him, teach us how to pray, and he utters that, with people taking fast notes so they can record it. Most modern scholars, especially John Dominic Crossan, would say that the various phrases in the Lord's Prayer were things that Jesus said individually many, many times. So many times that they were considered related because they were his favorite, some of his favorite things to do, to say. And there's two versions of the Lord's Prayer in Luke and in Matthew, and they're different. So obviously, nobody was there with notepad recording exactly what he said. But the various phrases were put together later on by the gospel writers and by the early church, probably, the earliest communities, repeating as much as they could what they had heard so many times. So the construction, the way the prayer is now, is a series of aphorisms that they were glued together. And there's a lot of stuff that you'll find where that's true. People will take one story, glue it to another, and it becomes a new story. And one of the things that Jesus did a lot of was to tell stories. And the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, they did tell some stories also. You'll find examples of them, but you find far more examples in the Greek scriptures of a single individual telling stories that you find in most of the prophets. Most of the prophets, I'll give you some examples here. This is chapter 10 from Yeshayahu, Isaiah. Woe to those who issue harsh decrees, penning orders that oppress people, robbing the weak of their rights, and defrauding the poor of their due, till widows fall to them as spoil, and orphans as their prey. What will you do when it comes time for the great assize? When the storm blows from abroad, to whom will you run then for help? And where will you put your plunder? Yours only to crouch low among the captives and fall under the corpses of the slain. And yet God's wrath is still not abated. So the Eternal's anger blazes against God's people, stretching out an arm against them, striking them till the mountains themselves tremble, and corpses lie like dung along the street. God signals to a foreign power, whistling for them for the end of the earth. Swiftly they come speedily, none tired, none tripping, not a belt slapped, not a shoestring broken, arrows sharpened, bows all bent, horses' hooves as hard as flint, chariot wheels like wind, whirlwinds, growling like a lion, growling like young lions, gripping their victim with a growl, bearing it off with none to rescue. That's pretty angry. It's also full of metaphors that are very typical in Hebrew writing, using animals and things like that, the outstretched arm and so forth. The writing is done in pairs. There's a this and then there's a that. There's a this and there's a that. They also have rhyme and meter in Hebrew. But Hebrew poetry depends an awful lot about saying one thing one way and saying the same thing another way, which is a different kind of rhyme. It's an idea rhyme as opposed to an actual sound rhyme. And you heard a lot of that in that particular translation of Isaiah. And this is so typical of the prophets. What they're saying is the economy is unjust and screwed up. And those who have the power to change it just keep it the way that it is because it's to their benefit. And so in this area of, geographically, Israel and Judah, the two kingdoms, they're at the crossroads of the Middle East. So the chances of the great big empires, Hatti, Assyria, Assur, and Egypt, coming and fighting their big battles on their land is very high. So the prophets are socially aware. And so they're saying, you keep this up and this is what's going to happen. Now, they're not doing Gene Dixon predictions. That's not what a prophet is in the Hebrew scriptures. They're not saying, on Tuesday, tomorrow, somebody named Joe is going to come knock at your door. They don't do things. They're using the language of anger and threat. This is what's going to happen if you keep acting this way. Maybe a translation in English is, you're going to bring it on yourselves, your destruction, by you acting so brutally toward the poor. Again, economics, the poor, the people who have all of the money and all the wealth, the oligarchs, to use a modern word in our newspapers, they're going to undo civilization, and then people from outside are going to come and undo them. So the Hebrew prophets are filled with this kind of stuff, absolutely filled. There's other things that they write that are really beautiful. For instance, this is also from Yeshayahu. This is from Isaiah 55. And this is actually words that are found in our hymn book in metrical form in one of our songs. And it's something that I put together and worked on the hymn book commission because I've always loved this passage from Isaiah. Just as rain and snow from the sky fall not in vain, but water the earth until it yields seed for the sower and food for the hungry. So with the promise that has passed my lips, it falls not fruitless and in vain, but works out what I will. For you shall go out in joy and be led forth in bliss. The hills shall burst into song before you, and all the trees of the wild shall clap their hands. Fir trees will grow instead of thorns, myrtles instead of nettles. And all of this shall redound to the Eternal's fame, a lasting monument of joy that never ends. So that beautiful passage with the natural imagery. And again, the prophets do use a lot of natural imagery, both in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Greek scriptures. A lot of the things that Yeshu said were agricultural, rooted in planting, rooted in farming, rooted in fig trees growing on the land. And this was, these were people who lived off the land. There were big cities, but mostly people were farmers. And one of the things that happened in the Greek era, when Yeshua was alive, in the 20s of the first century, the Galilee was a very rich place. There were lots of farms owned by small families, and the families had held some of these lands for generations. They grew all sorts of crops. The lake was filled with fish. There were olive groves. People in the Galilee tended to eat relatively well until something began to happen. So in the early 20s, Herod Antipas, the quarter king who ruled the Galilee and Perea, started to build a new city called Tiberias. It was the only Roman city built in the first century. There were some cities that were restored and rebuilt, but Tiberias was literally planned along Roman patterns with the two streets that crossed the main streets and so forth. And it took a lot of laborers that had to be fed. And so what Herod Antipas did is he began to confiscate family farms and bring them together under people who controlled whole areas, turning the people who used to own the farms into debt slaves, working their own land inherited from the grandparents. But now, because of the power of empire, they're barely getting along, covering all of this, these new mega farms. Something we see in the United States happening all the time. What the French say, or tout ça change. more things change than more they stay the same. So when the issue was starting to come into his adulthood, this was something he was very much aware of. And when he's talking about the poor and telling stories, he uses agricultural metaphors, and he also makes references a lot to farms and to ownership and to debts. So I'm going to read a couple of parables. Let's see, these all marked off someplace. Here we are. And when you do look at the Greek scriptures, be aware that when they were written, again, nobody was there with notepads saying, oh, he was talking to this guy on Wednesday and he said this. So when it says somebody asked Jesus a question and he responded with a story, the context is made up entirely. These stories come down as stories, and then they're inserted into a setting, kind of like a jewel is put into a ring. But the most important thing is the jewel, not the ring. So a man was going down from Jerusalem all the way to Jericho. And by chance, he fell amongst robbers who stripped him and beat him up and then went off, leaving him half dead. Now, it so chanced that a priest was going down the same road, but on seeing him, he walked to the other side of the road and passed him by. So did a Levite, a temple official, who came to the spot, and he saw him, but he too passed on the other side of the road. However, a Samaritan traveler came to where he was and immediately felt compassion when he saw him. He went to him and he bound his wounds up, pouring oil and wine into them, lifted him up onto his own steed, took him to an inn, and attended to him. He stayed the night. Next morning, he took out a couple of bills and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, attend to him, and if you are put out with any extra expense, I will refund you on my way back down this road. That's the story. Now, it's put into an interpretive setting. What you need to know is a couple of things. Samaritan was a group of people who lived in Israel between the Galilee and Judea. So like a middle state. They had their own temple on Mount Gerizim. They claimed the books of Moses too, the Torah, but they interpreted things differently. And they had their own rituals. There's still some left, not many, but there are some Samaritans left. And generally, the antipathy between the Judeans and the Samaritans was very great. So, like, for instance, when Galileans came down to Jerusalem for religious observation, the few that could afford to do that, they generally came down and walked around Samaria. They didn't want to go through. What's very interesting is that there's several stories in the New Testament that says that Jesus walked through Samaria and talked to Samaritans. So that says something right there. But, and there's also a very famous story where just before a Jewish holiday, a bunch of Samaritans came down to Jerusalem and they had satchels filled with dead people's bones. They went into the temple and threw them on the pavement of the temple, and bringing death into the temple, dead people's bones, was a complete sacrilege, and it was also, they had to postpone the rituals because they had to scrub the temple down from top to bottom and, get rid of the dead man's bones and do some prayers. They really, screwed up the temple worship in Jerusalem. And there was a lot of back and forth antipathy. So that sets the sense of the story, to give you a some context. So you have two religious officials walking past, and then this one person helping this guy who's been beaten up. And you need to know that when Jesus was saying these words, everybody around him knew that the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was dangerous. It was likely that you could be hit by robbers or some criminal. So many people traveled in caravans to avoid that. So the idea that this guy's, even the priest and so forth, are walking alone makes them kind of foolhardy also. So you've heard the parable from the Greek scriptures. Now I want you to listen to this. I read this in a service one Sunday many years ago. And it's one of the most amazing poems about biblical stuff that I've ever read. It's by a man named Neil Bowers. It's called Living the Parable. Wanting to be helpful, we all see ourselves as the Samaritan rather than the priest or his assistant, and never as the bruised man in the ditch, stripped and penniless, taken to a room smelling of figs and tallow, where he turns painfully in bed, tonguing his chipped tooth, touching his swollen eye. After all, how could anyone imagine himself mugged somewhere between Jerusalem and Jericho when he could ride in like some minor deity on a donkey packed with oil and wine, his fat purse tucked away, credit unlimited? Better to be the one without cracked ribs, safe on the hard-packed road, pausing long enough to help some creature with no luck. A dog, a sheep, a beaten man, not one of us. Every time I've read that, the bumps on my arms rise right up. And this helps me to understand what a parable is. A parable is not an allegory. It doesn't have one true response. A parable is a story where there are different characters, and you're invited to reflect on all of them. Where do you put yourself? Do you see yourself in any of these characters? And I think Neil Bowers is saying a powerful and risky statement by suggesting that probably most of us see ourselves as the Samaritan helping this poor guy. We're so privileged that it's not likely that we're going to be beaten on the road. and left for dead. So it's a very powerful, and all these stories were meant not to give a lesson, but to engage people with conversation, and which was kind of a typical thing to do. He wasn't just holding his finger up like this and saying, this is the way things are. He's telling these stories to engage with people and say, where are you in this? And all of his stories are like that, which makes them extremely obstreperous for some people. And they get interpreted as allegories to make sure that you don't see yourself in any of these characters. Let me get another one. Hold on. This is found in Matthew 20. And he's using the phrase, this is from a traditional biblical interpretation, kingdom of heaven. So let me talk about that for a minute. Heaven, it means sky. In Greek and in Hebrew, the words mean what we see when we look up and see Orion. It doesn't mean a city in clouds. It does not refer to life after death in any way. In Matthew, the phrase is Basileia ton Uranos, the kingdom of the heavens. It's usually plural, but it's reduced to singular when it's translated, because later Christians wanted to make it seem as if it was talking about life after death. It is not. Heaven was a substitute word for God. So in Mark and in Luke and in John, you'll find the phrase kingdom of God. Well, as John Dominic Crossan points out, Basileia, word that's translated as kingdom, was used in Greek to refer to the empire of Rome, with Caesar at the helm. And half the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. Only a small minority had the benefit of living in the Roman Empire with atriums in their homes and, kitchens. The slaves did everything for the wealthy. So, as Crossan translates it, the empire of God. So when Jesus is proclaiming the empire of God, he's proclaiming something political by saying not Caesar's empire, but the empire of God. That's kind of revolutionary. So the empire of God is different than the empire of Caesar. And throughout the Middle East, you will find monuments put up by various officials of the Roman government that talk about Caesar, Tiberius, as Filius Dei, Son of God. Many of the things, Lord, many of the things applied to Jesus have been true. Because the earliest Christians, they were Jews before they were Christians, but the earliest people kind of got it right. They recognized that he was proclaiming something radical against the Roman Empire. So the kingdom of God the empire of God is a lot different. So here's an example. For the empire of God, it's like a householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers to work in his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about 3 hours later, he saw others standing idly in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You go into the vineyard and work too. And whatever is right, I will give it to you." So they went. And again, this happened at the 6th hour and the 9th hour. And about the 11th hour, he went out and he found others standing still. And he said to them, "Why are you standing idle all day?" "Because no one has hired us," they said. "Well, you go into the vineyard too." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to the steward, "Call the laborers and pay them wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those who were hired about 11 hours into the day received a denarius, those hired early were really angry. "These guys only worked 1 hour, and you're giving them the equal amount to what we got working all day long in the hot sun?" And the householder said to them, "My friend, I'm not doing you any wrong. Did you not agree with me this morning for a denarius?" There is $20. Sounds unfair, doesn't it? It was very interesting in my old congregation in Newark. We used to have the Sunday school before church. And then we have adult sessions like this also before church. And so sometimes I would teach in religious education. And that Sunday during the service, I was going to be reading this parable and interpreting, working. So I decided to read it to the children. And they started talking to me about what they felt. But what was so interesting was when I went to talk to the adults were so much more resistant to this story than the children were. The children said, "Well, everyone should get the same amount. We're all human beings. And for some of us work more than others, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't all have access to everything that's good." They really saw in a very, very different way. But let's think about this in context of the sabbatical year, the Jubilee. So all of a sudden, with the Jubilee year, you find that things are equalized. Things are returned to a more equal stance. Slaves are set free. Money that was earned by entrepreneurial activity and capitalistic skill, it's taken away, returned to the people who originally owned the land. They had some hard times. It happens. Each of us probably knows something about hard times. They lost. But the idea was that people should all have equal access. And even though things fall apart, it's important to restore and reconnect them. The children got this. They talked about it beautifully. The adults resisted it very, very strongly. It was a very interesting experience for me to have. I'll do one more story before we take a break. From the Gospel of Luke. From the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. And one of the things about parables, when you read these things in the text, the literary commonplace is that the first sentence tells you who the characters are. Who are the important characters? Who are you dealing with? So although this story is called The Prodigal Son, that's not what it's about. Because it says very clearly, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of the two said to his father, "Give me my share of the inheritance now, the inheritance that falls to me." And so he divided his means among them. Not many days later, the younger son sold off everything he had been given and went abroad to distant lands, where he squandered his means in loose living, if you will. After he had spent everything, a severe famine set in throughout the land that he had gone to. And so he began to feel want. So he went and attached himself as a debt slave to a man of that land, who sent him out into the fields to feed swine. And he was desirous to fill his empty belly with the carob pods that the pigs were eating. But suddenly he came to his senses. He said, "How many hired men my father has, and how they all have more than enough to eat. And here I am dying of hunger. I'm going to get up and go back to my father, and I will say to him, 'Dad, I have sinned against you and against God. I don't deserve to be called your son. Only make me like one of your hired hands.'" So he got up and he made the journey back to his father. But when he was still rather far off, his father saw him and felt pity for him, and ran up to him and fell upon his neck and kissed him and kissed him. The son said what he intended. "Father, I have sinned against you and against God. I don't deserve to be called your son anymore." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe you can find and put it on my son, and give him a ring for his hand and sandals for his feet, and bring a fatted calf and kill it, and let us make a feast and be merry. For my son was dead, and he's come back to life. He was lost, and now he's been found." Now his elder son was out in the field when all this happened. And as he came near the house, he heard music and dancing to his surprise. So he summoned one of the servants and he asked what all this ruckus was about. The servant said, "Your brother has arrived and your father has killed a fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound." This angered him, and he would not go in. So his father came out and tried to appease him, but he replied, "Look at all the years I have been serving you faithfully. I never neglected any of your orders, and yet you have never given me so much as a kid to let me make merry with my friends at a feast. But as soon as this son of yours arrives, after wasting your means with sex workers, you kill a fatted calf for him." The father says to him, "My son, you and I are always together. All I have is yours. We could not but make merry and rejoice. For your brother here was dead, and he's come to life again. He was lost, but now he's found." Probably in your life, you've seen ballets with this story. It's been filmed, certainly, and it's been in some Jesus films. Jesus tells the story. It's in paintings a lot, so some very moving paintings. But again, the paintings only show the one side. They don't show the other one who's pissed off. And why is he pissed off? Well, he was doing the work all the time. You see the connection between this story and the last one? Or the one about the one about the vineyard? I've been here all this time. Dad's basically saying to you didn't want to be here. You were doing this for some other reason. So it's again a reference to the possibility of what kinds of discussions would happen if you said something about the Jubilee year, the sabbatical years. It was a troubling idea, and in the time of Jesus, there was all kinds of things that were put into law that avoided this, and some of them were mentioned in the Greek scriptures. One was you could give money that was intended for your parents to the temple, and that gave you grace, and your parents could wait for the sabbatical year to take care of them. But of course, it wasn't happening. It was all kind of a big ruse. But the scripture said this, but they came up with all kinds of things to make sure that it wasn't going to happen. And again, many modern people would understand that. They would say, well, this is all unfair. And when you read the Greek scriptures, you find a hell of a lot of unfairness to modern day understandings of what's fair and unfair. So the radicalness of what this Galilean prophet said is astonishing. Really. So let's take a break. We only have a half hour left. And,
Is my head in the way? Okay.
Yeah. Well, sort of. I'm a moderate Swift, yeah. As for the one sort of, even have time to go there. However, there's a movie coming. You heard about that? I got an email from the director about Lennox today, and they're like, and they're only, I think, Charlie is getting big, so it's gonna run like 4 days.
I know that it's going for a great amount of time.
No, but they're like those 2 days, they're running it.
I'm going to let this run because I don't want to lose the connection. So we'll just leave it like this with the microphone off. And when he comes back, we'll turn it on and we'll be off and running again.
We get the other one to the direct, so definitely, because but you know, I live in this area, so if something from the Lennox, I just was all on.
Are you voting?
Oh, yes.
I was supposed to. This way, you know, everyone. Friendship bracelet.
Oh, friendship bracelet. Yeah, I don't know if I'll go that. But I have invited my daughter and my granddaughters. They're different age, you know, so I don't know. Don't necessarily always have to say. I did get one of my granddaughters. Actually, one of two of my great grandsons. I took her to LA. I read it. I actually saw that. We all went together, and then my youngest grandson, mine, except my daughter, and my daughter. And then I think I got it and I wasn't serious.
Are you going to stay till midnight? On October. Well, I'm in that midnight. After the second midnight, comes on. There's
Oh, now where are they going to do that? If the movie's get
probably got spotted.
I don't follow that as well. I do, oh, okay, yeah, I'll probably see it.
Yeah. It's gonna be.
I saw her on the, what they call that thing on W3. The little, small artists come.
Like a tiny one?
Tiny, yeah, and she talked about some of the music and, you know, I was so impressed with her when she was younger. And the fact that she didn't say, you should go to Paris. I said, in your resources. Well, in other words, she restricts her audiences to coaches. She doesn't tell them. Which is so refreshing compared to somebody.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, I've been skiing there for about 40 years, the last time I skied. I was and I realized, okay, I don't have that. And, you know, in high altitude, I mean, that by itself. Well, we were restaurants. I never skied in Europe, although I am. But I didn't start skiing until I was 39. Yeah, a guy who was working with my husband. He got us to go out there once a week for a number. And I was actually a little bit later. I was in my late 30s. So I went into a lot of always was on the bus. We went to Vail
I'm already.
I was so worried, actually, so I went on the bus by myself. Stay through it, you know, we had a break. But I didn't break. They just would have been funny. I would have break my leg. I was so worried that when they saw me, they would think, well, that old lady, we don't want to. I wasn't out there. I left my kids. They were teenagers. I wasn't out there to mother anybody. But I stayed in everybody who's really all over the world says there's nothing better than better than, and I never bought it to eat. And all that ice,
Yeah.
you know, and I said, by the time I go on, I can be in the video. Yeah. It's kind of better than in the park quite a bit.
Yeah, she really was. I don't really see
Well, after 80, I did go. And not for me. My hands have trouble doing, you know, I couldn't just walk. I mean, I did that in Colorado lots of times. My husband generally I would be skiing by myself until it gets dark. So much fun. Anyway, maybe I'll see you at the movies.
So what happens to prophets when they open their mouth and tell stories?
They get killed.
They get killed.
Yes, but then they go to heaven.
Well, like I said, there is no place in the Gospels where Jesus talks about heaven as a place after death. No place, nor hell. The translation of hell of the words Hades and Gehenna is dishonest. It has nothing at all to do with the later Catholic and Reformation theory that there's eternal conscious punishment when you die, if you're a bad person. None of that is in the Greek scriptures. And translation, translation is always political. I'm trying to remember if I said this last week, but like in the King James Version, a very bad version of translation, Paul talks about a woman named Eunia, he calls an envoy, apostolos, an apostle. It's a very high word to call somebody an envoy, an apostle. But the King James Version, because they were still smarting after the fact that Elizabeth Regina had been king, she called herself king, a woman in charge. They wanted to make sure this would never happen again. So they just simply changed it to Unius, a man's name. They lied. Just totally lied. And throughout the New Testament, English translations, you'll find people in the various languages trying to grind their own theories by translating things in a way that supports their theories, their understanding of things, their theology. So modern day scholarly translations exist, but they are also, not popular. The Jesus Seminar did a wonderful translation of the Gospels, and maybe I'll bring it next week. But they debated a long time how to translate the Greek word makarios. It's translated in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke as blessed or blessed, depending on how you say that. And they just said, well, this is not a word that conveys the kind of information that the word makarios actually means in Greek. So they translated the beginning of the Beatitudes, which are traditionally, blessed are the poor. Well, Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? Luke says plainly, blessed are the tokoi, blessed are the destitute. They're really poor. So they said, they translated makarios as congratulations to you who are poor, because your life is about to turn around. There's about to be justice in you. Again, references obliquely to the idea of the sabbatical year, where debts are canceled and slaves are set free. So, that's, it sounds very modern and sassy and whatever, but is much more accurate for what makarios means. In modern day US English, the version I've been reading from is by James Moffat. This is English, which is different. They use different phrases and words than we do and always have. Next week I can talk about different translations that are available. But commentaries are important to read when you're reading.
In Isaiah, it says a young woman shall give birth, and then when you get to the gospel, it says a virgin. Is that a mistake?
No, that's not a mistake. Isaiah says an Alma, a young woman of marriageable age, which meant in those days, 12 to 15, a young woman of marriageable age will conceive and bear a son. It has absolutely nothing at all to do with Jesus. And the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, rendered that as Parthenos, virgin. Some of you probably know, if you've gone to Athens, that the Parthenon is the temple of the Virgin of Bina. So it was a word that had more of a modern meaning. The word virgin had more of a modern meaning. But in the Greek of the time, it also could mean a young marriageable woman. But over time, the sense of what a virgin was changed and became something much more biological. So they weren't lying. They were speaking the Greek of their time. The idea that the Hebrew scriptures predict things that went on in the Greek scriptures is 100% false. I'll make that bold statement and I'll defend it. Those were interpretive things that the early Christians used to try to understand how it could be that this man that they loved and cared about so much had been snatched for them completely And I want you to know that all of the stories in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, which tell you about the trial of Jesus, are all entirely fiction. Nobody was there taking notes. Pilate did not say, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate did not say, "Who are you?" None of that. That was all written later. What happened was Jesus was basically snatched by the Roman government and crucified. And Pilate was famous, according to Josephus and Philo of Alexandria. He was famous for crucifying people because he wanted to, without trials. So, it's great for a movie to have Pilate talking to Jesus and having these little dialogues and stuff like that. But we absolutely don't know. All we know is Pilatus said at some time in the middle of April in the year 30, he beat up Kuchen, take him to the cross. And that's it.
You mean that thing with Barabbas? Isn't?
No, there's no historicity on that. And there's no historicity about. Pilate is portrayed in the Gospels entirely at odds with every other historical presentation of him. He was known. We have archaeological evidence for him. It's not just literary records. We have, a sign that talks about him in Caesarea. But Josephus has nothing good to say about him.
There is this story, I read it on YouTube, that the people picked Jesus to be executed rather than Barabbas because they wanted Jesus to be king-like and save them. And Barabbas was the strong one who fulfilled that role.
Yeah.
Is that all made up?
So,
That was before AI.
In the Old Testament, the Hebrew scripture,
yeah,
about there's like specific dates with regard to Jubilee in those dates. Jesus in what's attributed to him in the Greek scriptures, he seems to be more in general. Is he expanding like a more utopian way of living?
but to a certain extent, he was being faithful to the Torah. We don't think that he was literate, because most people weren't. 3 to 4% were literate in that area of the world. But hearing things, like I said, there's rhyme and meter, there's parallelism. It's easier to memorize things that you hear if all of that is true. So people knew great many of the scriptures. And I think Jesus was a Galilean who saw that these things were there and wondered why they weren't put into practice. Because he was obviously devout in some way. Yeah. So he just questioned.
But and again, just taking what was written. Parables don't seem to have the dates like the Hebrew scripture, as far as Jubilee dates. Jesus seems to be talking more in general.
He's talking about, he doesn't talk about dates. The Jubilee year is still counted. It's going to be in 2028 in Jewish calendar. So, people actually maintain the idea of it, but nothing's going to be done in 2028. So I think he's talking and experimenting with what does this mean if this is in the Torah. There's a phrase in the Gospel of Matthew where he says not one seraph or period is going to be taken away from the Hebrew scriptures. I'm here not to destroy the Hebrew scriptures, but to bring them about. And so my understanding of things, that fits the ideas of the parables more than anything else. My way of talking about this, my way of talking about this, and there's literally hundreds of ways that people look at Jesus. Next week I'll bring something in that will make you laugh, give you a list of all the totally crackpot ideas that people have come up with by reading the Greek scriptures. And I'm not generous about calling them crackpot. They are crackpot as far as I'm concerned. Like the Passover plot when I was growing up, that was a real thing. Yeah, again, all this stuff takes the Bible literally. When Jesus died, it just happened quickly, and it was a shock to all the people who cared for him. It was complete and utter shock. And any of you who have experienced a sudden death in your life of someone that you loved and cared about, traffic accident, something like that, a fall, it's different than watching a death happen over a period of time. In the cancer world, it's a different collection of emotions. So the emotions that people went through were more based upon the shock value that all of a sudden here he was, and then all of a sudden he wasn't. And there's debates. John Dominic Crossan has long felt that even the empty tomb story is a later fabrication. The idea that he was buried at all is a later fabrication. Now, some people don't. Some people who are serious scholars think that, yes, perhaps he was buried. But John Dominic Crossan said in general, when people were crucified, they were thrown into a lime pit because they were not considered human. If you were in revolt against the empire, you should be erased. And crucifying people and throwing them into a pit is a nice way of erasing someone. But yeah, I can go the other way too. And there's never any way that we'll ever find out. We can look at the data and come up with things that make the most sense to us based upon the most reliable ancient data. We do have archaeologically, and I saw this when I was at a museum in Tel Aviv many years ago. We have a crucified bone of a crucified man. And the reason we have it, his name was Yohanan, John. And his bones were in a bone jar after his body, his flesh had rotted away. And he had been crucified, and the nail hit a knot in the wood. So they couldn't take it out. So they cut that whole section of wood with the nail still in it. And so that's preserved. So we know that in that part of the world, nailing was done as it's described. We also know that that area is not famous for its forests. And crucifixion was done so frequently there, during the time of Adrian, after the second Jewish revolt under Bar Kokhba, 500 people were crucified each day. When Jesus was a kid in Nazareth, 6,000 people were crucified in his neighborhood because of a rebellion, a historical rebellion by a guy named Yehuda from the Galilee. He revolted against Rome, and Rome is efficient. So they gathered all the people who had rebelled and crucified. to de-romanticize crucifixion. Come up and look at this afterward if you want. This is a Russian painter, Nikolai Gay. And this painting no longer exists. It somehow got destroyed during the Second World War. I've seen his other paintings when I was in Russia. But he was kind of a left-wing guy who thought of Jesus as a radical peasant, way back before all of the Bible scholarship that we've had in the last 30 years. And he did some research. You can maybe show people more. We only have this black and white photograph, because the painting, like I said, was lost. But it shows crucifixion without romance. Not a great big high thing, close to the ground. Nails, nobody cared, just walking away. And people could last a long time. It was designed very carefully by the torturers who invented it. It was invented by the Persians originally. But you could last up to 2 or 3 days if they did it in a certain way, so that your punishment was long and torturous. And even in the Greek scriptures, Pilate expresses some shock that Jesus died so soon. It's only been like 6 hours and he's already dead. And that's based upon the fact that people thought that people lived for days. So anyway, this is what happened. And what happened to his body afterward, we'll never finally know.
Is there like a shroud or something that people claim was by his body that
They,
has
they claim, and there's no truth to it at all. We know the dating of that shroud goes to the 14th century. We know how it was made.
no?
We hear about men being crucified, well, women crucified.
Women were crucified also. Generally, they were crucified naked. So the idea that Jesus was wearing clothes or a breechcloth, nudity was considered, a bad thing. And so, however, they could punish them. And the sign on top of Jesus, according to all 4 Gospels, that he claimed to be the emperor of Jews, he was the Jews, but translated as emperor, is a political charge, and it's sarcastic, mockery. And it sounds like something from what we know about Pilate. It sounds like something he might have done because he was an asshole.
So this story with Barabbas and the people saying, they took Barabbas, wasn't that also used as against the Jews? They were responsible.
Right. No, that's exactly right. The anti-Semitism was written into the New Testament.
But it was made up.
It was made up. Yeah, the whole thing was made up. The whole trial before Pilate, was Jesus taken before the high priest? We have no way of knowing, but mostly people think that that was made up too. Were the high priest and Pilate in cahoots with each other? Yes. We have plenty of evidence of that. They were the extremely wealthy end of things. They were the oligarchs. We've discovered one of the residences of the high priest that is just beautiful, mosaics, and, just Roman style architecture. So they were confused to keep order. And you can say that something that's extraordinary about Pilate is that he was prefect for 10 years. He was finally deposed because he did a really horrible massacre. It was realizing that the emperor realized he needed to be called back. Claudius, said, no, you can't do this. He was just going slaughtering people. But he kept order, not for peace, but he kept order during these 10 years. The longest prefect in the history of the prefects, which started in the year 6 singing. And then ended with the tearing down of the temple, rebuilt in the year 68, 69, and 70. So I think that's it. I'm done. And next week I'll try and bring some other things in, talk about poetry.